I took in a large breath and picked up my book bag. Okay, I thought. I'm going to grab my stuff, close my eyes, turn around, and make a dash past the parade of hunchbacks, dodge the arrows fired from the goblins in the forest, and zoom up the driveway through the front door. I took off through the night like a bolt of young lightning. I was by the front door in seconds. Panic took up residence behind a big bush and the side of our trailer. I left him there for the night. I was safe now with my guard dog. I recalled Thubten telling me about foo dogs, called Lions of Buddha by the Tibetans. Small statues of dogs that were placed outside of the door and were believed to guard those who dwelled within. When I passed through the threshold of our tiny house, I was not bombarded by the musk of dry burnt beef, nor by the rank of some devious casserole. When I went into the kitchen to grab some potato chips, I saw that they had bought fried chicken for themselves. The bucket was empty save a few pieces of flaked off chicken skin. I grabbed my chips and tiptoed back to my room. When I passed by my mother's bedroom, I heard the rumble of an argument. It wasn't my mother and Mr. Riley. It was Mr. Riley screaming, presumably into the mouthpiece of a telephone. Probably his wife, asking if he would come home. I didn't want to get caught eavesdropping, so I continued on to my room. When I got there, I dropped my bag, stripped down, and streaked naked to the bathroom, where I drew the water for a nice warm bath. I didn't normally care to bathe, but Emily had begun to change my hygiene habits drastically in these last couple of days. The soap skipped across my body like a stone on the surface of a pond, lathering every inch of my body. When I was covered, I rinsed off and repeated the lathering. Half a bar of soap was gone before I was through. I sat in stillness after I was clean, planning out my words to her carefully. Emily, I cherish you. I had forgotten by this time that Emily wasn't her real name. Emily, you are breathtaking. I want to be with you always. Emily, you make me feel like a slimy snail. Take off your shell for me. What? I got out of the tub and dried myself off. The angry sounds that resonated from my mother's room were now louder and more violent. This was routine. I just went to my room with a towel around my waist and put on some boxer shorts. The next thing I knew, I was under my bed with the poem out in front of me, and I was drawing little snails in my red notebook. Some snails with long spiral shells, some with small rounded shells, all of them dancing close to each other. A sudden thought came to mind, a question I would one day know the answer to. Is love more universal than pain? I drew snails until I fell asleep. I followed the trail they drew behind them like sticky sugar water, and I arrived at a dream. Snails. Thousands of them in a stainless steel box. A little girl scoops salt out of a sandbox with her little yellow shovel. Slowly, she fills the metal box to the brim with salt. All the wonderful snails wither away and become a big salty puddle of gastropod. The girl smiles when they are all dead. Her name is Sheila, but she looks like an Emily. The girl goes back into her little cottage, and the rain comes to take her place. The little sandbox fills with water, and the sea is born in her tiny fenced-in backyard, a watery grave for love. The dream kept going, but I was awake now, awake and sweating. Yells. A scream. I heard something get pushed off of the mantle. Love is light, and darkness cannot exist unless something obstructs the light. That bitch, who does she think she is? She's not my goddamn mother. Separation my ass. We don't need a separation. That bitch would be nothing without me. Mr. Riley screamed at the top of his lungs. Just because she has all the money, she thinks she can call the shots. Those are my goddamn planes. I put my blood and sweat into them. She can't take them from me. I don't care what her name is on. Baby, calm down, honey, my mother whimpered. You still have me. You'll always have me, baby. I heard the wet, meaty sound of his hand whipping across her face. I don't give two licks about you, bitch. You're just a piece of ass on the side. You can't give me anything in this piece of shit trailer. She owns everything I have. I have nothing if she leaves. Got that? If I don't go home tonight, I lose everything, fumed and enraged Mr. Riley. I heard my mother sobbing loudly. Shut it, Sheila. Stop your blathering. I crawled out from under my bed and crept towards the door. I was nervous, breathing hard and sweating all over. I always felt like this when this sort of thing happened, waking up in the middle of the night to the shatters and screaming voices. My heart felt like it was about to break my ribs. I very slowly turned the handle of my door, careful to shield the sound of the click with my clammy palm. As I cracked the door, the light from the den cut into my dark room like a sword of yellow. Contrasting black shadows shot across the streak of light as Mr. Riley pounced around the room in an angry fit. I was scared out of my mind, but my curiosity always outweighed my better judgment. That's it. I'm going home to my dumb bitch of a wife, Mr. Riley said in a cold, hostile voice. He sounded almost defeated, but still smoldering. No, baby, please don't. I love you. You know that. You just had too much to drink. My mother's hands were clasped together tight and pressed close to her chest as she begged him not to leave. Mr. Riley grabbed his coat, his pack of cigarettes, and reached for his keys. Before he could grab them, my mother snatched them up and held them tightly behind her back. Please, please don't go. Some would have called her lonely. Some would have called her selfish. Some would have even called her a whore. I called her mom. Please don't go, baby. I'll suck you off right now. Just please don't go back to her. I'll do anything for you, anything. The keys were still behind her back. He very calmly looked down at his feet and with a single motion reached up with one hand to grab her by the throat and pulled his other fist around to make full contact with the left side of her face. I heard her cheek crack. I pissed in my boxers and let loose of the door when he hit her. It swung wide open in front of me and I was left in the open, just standing there. Pee ran down my legs and onto the carpet. I had never seen him hit anyone like that. She dropped to the floor like a wet bag of sand. I could smell the alcohol and rage that was pouring out of the room. He looked over at me with eyes that were cold and honest in their sincere hatred of me. I was in his crosshairs and frozen solid. My mother lay there, silent and still. I mustered my courage and ran past him for the kitchen, the Mustang of courage, leaping over the fence of fear. He ran after me. I grabbed a knife off of the counter. It was just a butter knife, but I was desperate and still a boy. I fumbled over the lock on the back of the door. He was only a few feet behind me. He flung the table and it flipped up in the air and landed on its top. My mother's ceramic cow collection fell off the shelf, and our little trailer shook mightily. I started crying, and finally the lock clicked. In half a second, the door was flung open, and I was sprinting on the night air like wing-footed Mercury. Panic guarded the door like a loyal food dog, and when Mr. Riley jolted after me, panic lunged. The black snap would have taken off Mr. Riley's nose if he hadn't stumbled backwards into the trailer, falling down in between our washer and dryer. I ran across the road and into my field, the place of heavy haze and disrupted daydreams. I took a quick left and ran onto Pastor Casey's front porch. Panic caught up with me, and I didn't see Mr. Riley anywhere behind me. I started banging on the pastor's screen door with the butter knife still tightly held in my hand. "Let me in, please, God, let me in. He's going to kill me," I screamed. I was crying so hard I couldn't see when Pastor Casey opened the front door. He grabbed me by the shoulder and pulled me into the safety of his house. Panic followed. The pastor closed and locked the front door, and very slowly took the dull knife from my hand and put it on his coffee table. "What's wrong, Jacob?" "Mr. Riley." I was out of breath and scared, still looking at the door, expecting him to burst in at any second. "Your mother's boyfriend?" "Mr. Riley, he hit her. He's drunk. She fell down, chased me." I started crying again, just having realized how scary my reality was. It seemed like some nightmare that had come to life. "Calm down, Jacob." Pastor Casey's wife stood in the hallway leading to their bedroom, holding a shotgun with the butt under her armpit. She was wearing a white nightgown that came down to her ankles, and a black sleep mask on her forehead. She was a large woman with calves as big as cantaloupes and brown hair that sat, choppy and asymmetrical, on the top of her square head. "What's going on out there, Peter?" she asked him in a sweet, soft voice that seemed as if it came from a much smaller woman. I was still crying pretty hard, but the sight of that strong Amazon woman holding that small cannon under her arm made me feel much better. Panic licked my fingers. "Jacob had some problems at home," he said. "Now, Jacob, you wait right here with Mrs. Martha. I'm going to use the phone, and I'll be right back." Pastor Casey wasn't a very attractive man. He had 2 long curving scars across his brow. His cheeks were prominent and asymmetrical, thick with scar tissue that didn't disintegrate with time, only solidified into lumps. His hair was cropped, short and dark. His fingers were long and soft, with just a hint of callus that had long since smoothed away. His eyes alone told the story of his past. They were pensive, plagued. He looked at his wife with an adoring, hopeful regret that lingered in his gaze like mud puddles refusing to dry. He didn't look as strong as his wife, but he looked resilient and wise. I aspired to be like him one day. He gave me a soft pat on the head, then walked over to his wife and whispered something in her ear. She nodded her head and he disappeared into the other room. She covered me up with a shawl that was thrown over an old brown armchair, and I had a seat. I heard the old rotary phone dialing slowly. "Who is he calling?" I asked. "He's going to call the police, Jacob." "Why?" "To go check on your mama and take that bad man away so he can't hurt anyone anymore." "Good. I hate him." I said this with the most vacant expression on my face. Mrs. Casey didn't reply for a few seconds. Now, Jacob, you didn't mean that, did you? I hate him. I hate him so much. He is so mean. A single fat tear slid out of my eye, but my face was still. It fell to my leg with an audible drip. Mr. Riley is the devil, I said after a few seconds of inner thought. No, Mr. Riley is just a man who made a lot of bad mistakes, and now he is suffering for them. His heart is just cold because all he does is suffer now, she added. Pastor Casey walked back into the room and said, Isn't Lucifer just an angel who made a lot of bad choices and now he is suffering for them, Mrs. Martha? Well, dear, we all make bad choices, but it doesn't make us all demons, she replied. True, dear, but it does make us all sinners, similar to demons, he said. Sinners can be forgiven. Demons can't, she retorted. Anything can be forgiven if you ask God for forgiveness. Demons don't ask. God is love, and love knows no limit to forgiveness, he said with a half smile. God is the universal superconsciousness that is abundant in all life. God is the hive mind of all pure thinking beings in our universe, past, present, and future. God is only pure love that resonates before, during, and after human death. God is not a mind, but a force of consciousness acting together for a common purpose, to spread peace, companionship, patience, and happiness. God is heaven, and heaven is in us if we will it so. God is not what you consider him to be. God is even more amazing than you could imagine. We were God, are God, and will be a perfect, all-knowing, all-seeing God. Reality, back to reality. I really hated his casual means of conversion. I mean, I knew he was a faithful, God-fearing man, but he didn't have to try and force his religion on me, regardless of how subtle he was. We made small talk, as best we could in such a tense situation. He asked me about school and my father. Time passed slowly. Only 15 minutes had passed, and already Mrs. Casey had fallen asleep in an armchair, with her blunderbuss and panic beside her. I heard sirens off in the distance and saw police lights stream into the parsonage blinds as two white and blue cruisers pulled up in my driveway across the street. Martha didn't stir. Pastor Casey tried to keep my mind off of everything. He came to me with the light he knew best. Everything happens for a reason. God has a plan for us all. If you don't have it in your heart to forgive, you will become a bitter, sour person, as bitter as the person you can't forgive. Do you really want to become like Mr. Riley? Do you want to be bound by your hatred? No. Have faith in the path God has set before you. You should be free from the awful burden of hatred, Jacob. The only way to be free is to believe that something more powerful than anything you could possibly understand is guiding your hand. The love of God gives you peace. When you realize that, Jacob, you will feel like you are floating on the breeze. Pterodactyls, eagles, soaring high into the sky. Letting Christ into your life will set you free, Jacob. The only way you can let Christ into your life is if you forgive. But I don't really believe in the whole Jesus thing, Mr. Casey. I found this whole spiel annoying. I mean, I know you do and stuff, but you have a good life. Look at my life. Look at what's happening to my mother. I don't see how God could let that happen to me and her. I didn't do anything to deserve this kind of life. What kind of God would let this stuff happen? Do you know where the name Jacob comes from? My mother. I mean, do you know where she got it? I don't know. I didn't really care either. Jacob is Joseph's father. I guess he was a lot like you. He suffered for many years trying to be happy. God put him through trial after trial, but by the time he finally overcame his challenge, he had lost his faith in God. Like you said, what kind of God would let this stuff happen? He wrestled with God on top of a mountain. On top of the mountain, serene and natural, unharmed by human hands. Wrestled with God? Wrestled with the idea of God, I guess. Wrestled with faith. And struggled to understand God's plan. What kind of God would let this much pain come to him? This much suffering? I thought for a second and replied, suffering and love are one and the same. I guess that is called tough love. Jacob had to suffer to understand the extent to which God would provide for him. Sometimes, though, we must suffer for the sake of love and suffer because we love. Because with love comes empathy, and with empathy comes pain. Sort of like how Christ would cry when he healed the sick, or his death on the cross. We all suffer to some extent during our lives, but in God we can shed our pain and transcend into his divine love. Then God spoke to Jacob. Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed. And Jacob was then called Israel, because the name Israel means one who struggles with God and prevails. And then he built an altar to God on the mountaintop where he struggled. I repeated that to myself. I repeated it again and again. I cried softly. I cried harder. I repeated it again. Am I like Israel? First, you have to overcome your struggle to forgive. Mr. Riley is just an innocent man who knows not what he does. And because of that, you have to find it in your heart to love him, just like every other flawed, sinful human. We are all part of God's creation, and his Holy Spirit is inside us all, no matter how we act on the surface. I instantly thought of the retarded child that wounded a bald eagle in my dream. He didn't mean to be cruel. He just didn't know any better. But what happened in the end? Karma. Do you believe in karma, Pastor Casey? Well, it depends, I guess. What is your idea of karma? I guess it is the force that makes things equal. If you hurt someone else, you will hurt. If you do something nice for someone else, something nice will happen to you. That's what karma is. I don't believe that the physical life has that kind of natural balance. I think sometimes nothing but bad things will happen to good people, and the only end to their suffering will be their death and their ascension into heaven. I guess what you do in this life does come back to you, but after you have passed on from this world. If you are a bad person, you will suffer accordingly in hell. If you're a good person, you will be in peaceful rest in heaven. I think life only has balance in death, but most of all, I believe the key to living a good life isn't just through doing good deeds. Accepting Christ as your shepherd, bread, water, and Savior is the key to heaven. So to answer your question, no, I don't really believe in karma. I believe in divine justice. Pastor Casey told me that he used to be a very violent boy when he was younger. The story was a hard one to hear from such a sweet man. His father believed that sparing the rod was spoiling the child. Thusly, Peter grew up to be the mirror image of his father. Due to his enormous size for his age and his tremendous pent-up anger, he terrified many frail boys during his high school career. This violence escalated to robbery. He would stalk wimpy rich boys and wait until they were alone to take their wallets, their watches, sometimes even their shoes. One day he ran into some bad luck. Excuse me. The rich kid he chose that day was not only a good fighter on the high school wrestling team, but armed as well. When Peter asked him to hand over his wallet, the boy slugged him across the jaw and pulled out a hunting knife from under his coat. Peter fell to the ground and the boy threatened to slit his throat. Peter started crying, and the boy proceeded to kick him in the face until he was out like a light. While Peter was unconscious, the boy went absolutely crazy on him. He stomped on his face with his boots, broke all but one of his ribs, 6 of his fingers, both bones in his lower right arm, and completely and permanently destroyed Peter's reproductive organs, leaving only a wrinkled, bloody remain of his testicles. When Peter woke up, he couldn't move, and when someone finally found him, he was half dead. The healing process took several months, and his hormone therapy shots lasted over 2 years. During those 2 years, Peter fell in love with Martha Harthy, the editor of the local high school newspaper. She saw through his scarred face with lopsided cheekbones and loved him completely. As many boys his age did, he wanted to have sex with the girl he loved, but he couldn't. He would enter the kingdom of heaven as a virgin, never having known the physical act of love. The fact that he was now impotent, somewhat disfigured, and disabled absolutely crushed him spiritually. He didn't play basketball for fear of humiliation in the locker room. He wasn't able to beat anyone up for sheer lack of strength. His father didn't even waste time beating his worthless body anymore. He lacked everything but the suffering in his life and the unconditional love for Martha. He turned to a path of peace that would destroy the suffering and allow only love to remain. And in this peace, he found the essence of God. With God came Christ. With Christ came an outlet for his suffering, a martyr on which to release his pain. At this point, he didn't even need sex anymore, but Martha wanted children. We talked a while longer, and then he walked off and returned with a glass of orange juice. I drank it and we talked for several more minutes. A less serious conversation. School, girls, friends. He even feigned an interest in music. It was pleasant. He tucked me into bed in the guest room. Panic, who had been sleeping in the living room next to Mrs. Casey's legs, followed me. I still had on my wet underwear, but it was mostly dry by then. Martha's shawl was warm. If I had any of their shorts, I would let you change into them, but I am afraid they are all too big for you. If you want to, after you crawl in bed and I leave the room, you can throw those wet ones on the floor so you can sleep better. Thank you, Pastor. He said a quick prayer, recalling notes of suffering and faith from our earlier discussion. He made the symbol of the cross over his chest and prayed that I have a safe and wonderful day to come. A day that would be so bright that I wouldn't even be able to recall this dark night. He kissed my forehead. I smiled and he left the room. Before the door was completely closed, my damp boxers were hitting the floor. I had never slept in the nude before. It was stimulating, being able to feel every stitch of linen against my skin. The window let in the moon and my field of daydreams. I could almost swear I saw a shimmering shadow hovering over the field. I looked over at the clock. 3:03 a.m. I slipped away from the darkness of this world into a velvet soft quiet. I enter my dreamland through the ripe, blistered clouds of heaven. I tear through them like a bullet ripping through the wet flesh of a melon. Drops of dew fly past me, and the clouds explode with rain. I fly, I soar, I take to the sky like a spiraling rocket. I dance on the top of trees, take showers in the warm rain while traveling at sonic speeds. I blow birds out of the sky as I pass them by. I have never been so free. I spell out in pterodactyl smoky letters an old word and a new. Through my suffering, I will be made new. I believe. And I am off again, shooting straight into the stillness of outer space, basking in the warmth of the sun. The sun. Good night.